Hello, everyone. Welcome to Trade and Tariffs. It's usually held on Tuesdays, but considering the holiday this week, we decided to bump back today's webinar, so it is now Trade and Tariff Thursdays, but only for this week. We're back with another edition of Avalara's webinar series discussing the Trump administration's tariffs and their impact on trade compliance. We started this weekly series back in February. If this is your first time, welcome. And if you've joined us before, welcome back. We're glad to have you. My name is Courtney. I'll be your host and moderator for today. But before we dive in, just a couple of housekeeping items. So first and foremost, I always have to remind folks that Avalara cannot provide legal or tax advice, but as always, we do our best to answer your questions as thoroughly as we can. And then I'm going to leave up our safe harbor policy on your screen. Please take a moment to review this while I continue with some other housekeeping items. So if you've attended our webinars before, you know that we are recording today's event. You will receive a link to the recording later today. So keep your eye on your email inboxes if you'd like to listen to it again or share it with a colleague. Next, let's review this webinar console that we're looking at. The console and all of those windows that you see can be customized, so feel free to move them around or resize the windows by dragging and dropping the corners of the windows. And then we also have an additional resources section that contains a lot of great resources, including the slide deck. So if you'd like to download that to follow along or save it for later, you're welcome to do so. And then there are also several ways that you can engage with our presenters and fellow attendees today. If you have any questions, please submit them using the Ask a Question box over on the right-hand side. We do have some time set aside at the end for Q&A, so you can submit your questions there that you'd like the presenters to see. And if you also are having any troubleshooting questions, you can also submit them there. And then second, you can join our attendee chat. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see some icons. Click on the one that looks like text messages or two chat bubbles. The attendee chat will then appear, and you can introduce yourself to your fellow attendees, network, and just discuss today's topics. And then third, you can also react to the presentation by clicking on the emoji icon down at the bottom and sending us your reactions. And last, just a reminder, today's webinar will continue on with the 45-minute format to allow more time for audience Q&A. Since this session is less than an hour and intended to be more interactive, it is not eligible for CPE credit. So just a reminder, we do have some poll questions, but you will not be receiving CPE credit for this presentation. And then just a reminder, Avalara's customer conference, Crush, is going on tour this year. If you are interested in checking out when and where, go to events.avalara.com for more details. And finally, let's meet our two presenters today. So today we have Marty Taffet, and we are also joined by Brian Maggio. So Marty, I think I'm going to pass it over to you if you want to say a quick hello and introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm Marty Taffet. I am a Senior Business Development Manager here at Avalara, and I support our cross-border team. So working with a lot of our enterprise partners and their cross-border compliance issues.
And my name is Brian Maggio. I'm the director of our strategic business development team here at Avalara. I've been here for 4 years and have been a member of the trade and compliance community going on 10 plus years at this stage. Look forward to discussing the constant changes that are coming down the pike here with everyone.
Yep. Yeah, for everyone, I roped Brian into presenting last minute, and I told him yesterday that it was gonna be really easy. And then, of course, last night, Trump's tariffs got temporarily paused, or maybe temporarily paused, but it remains to be seen. So, just another reason to hop on Tariff Tuesday or Tariff Thursday and chat about compliance. So today, the agenda is we're going to talk about latest news, then we're going to talk about the implications to your business and how to take action with Avalara, and then finally we'll open up to Q&A. So first to start with the poll question, when does the reciprocal tariff trade pause and for the US trade partners excluding China? May 19th, July 1st, July 9th, or July 29th. And we'll give you guys some time to answer these questions.
Hopefully nobody selects May 19th, being that we are already past that date.
Awesome. Give a couple more seconds for people to respond. Let's see. All right. See how we did. Awesome. Great. So most of you selected July 9th, which is the correct answer. We have had this question before, but I think it speaks to, how much things change and how hard it can be to get things right. You know, it's hard because things do change quite a bit, and we have had to really keep our thumbs on the pulse of what's going on with cross-border right now. But it's glad that we're working with a pretty informed audience, it seems. So the latest news in tariffs. Obviously, last night, the CIT court put a permanent injunction on the IEEPA tariffs that Trump put in. So Trump's organization immediately filed an appeal. So it doesn't seem like we're going to get changes to those tariffs 10 days out like the court wanted. So we're still trying to sift through what those announcements will be. I imagine by next Tariff Tuesday, we will have a lot more clarity on what that looks like. But right now, I know that we're sifting through all those things, but would love to hear in the comments what you guys think is going to happen. But right now, it's kind of a too soon to make any kind of substantiated guess on when or if those tariffs will be removed and how that'll affect things like de minimis and our other tariffs that are been in place. From what I've read already this morning, it doesn't sound like it's going to impact the steel or aluminum tariffs. So that if you are impacted by those, that's something that you can probably bet on staying the same. The other thing too is that if these do get repealed, Trump and his administration do have other ways to still increase tariffs on China. The Trade Act of 1974, and I think it's Section 232, still allows for the president to impose tariffs for certain amounts of time. So, clear as mud, unfortunately, but it's something we're working with and working with our partners to make sure that they're as informed as possible. So this was the Liberation Day tariffs. So a lot of these could fall off if the Supreme Court upholds the CIT court decision, but we will see. And then this was kind of the timeline of where things stood. As you can see, there were a ton of changes early in February. A lot of you have been a part of these conversations since February, since we've been doing these. Some have changed, some haven't. The interesting things that have come up are that Trump has talked about has been really, working on certain kind of either verticals or certain products, and that's really, the next thing that's been in the news. So, last week Trump threatened, Apple to make sure that they were building not in China. Then Tim Cook pivoted quickly to India. Then Trump said, no one wants in America. And then Tim Cook and Apple made a big pledge to start building things in America. So, we are starting to see more investments in American manufacturing. So it is getting what President Trump wants. But it just remains to be seen, the impacts of the court case and how things fall out. So, we'll see. But we are getting some good questions about the court decision. If the Supreme Court agrees with the latest court decisions on tariffs, can we get the tariffs that we've already paid refunded? That is a really good question. So from what I've read, that there's differing opinions on the existing IEEPA tariffs that have been collected by the Border Patrol around um, around the tariffs that have been collected. If the Supreme Court does agree and uphold the CIT court ruling, what could potentially follow is either a blanket refund from Border Patrol, or I have read also that potentially there could be either like a civil suit um, from individual companies trying to claw back those tariffs. So again, I'm not a policy wonk. I'm not going to pretend I'm a lawyer either. But just from what I've read, there's a possibility that companies could claw back the tariffs they've already paid.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I've also seen that. And then the other question, right? Like, what a time to be alive. What's going to happen to the 14 trillion in investments by, various countries and companies that were pledged as a result of the tariffs? Ultimately, do those pledges hold? What happens to that? It'll be quite interesting to see how this all shakes out, and what changes continue to evolve here.
Yeah, and one of the things that come from the changes that happened was the end of de minimis. So a lot of large merchants, especially e-commerce companies, have changed their supply chain around de minimis exceptions. So like, what happens if de minimis is back on the board? Um, Obviously it's something that with the growth of e-commerce, a lot of different companies have taken advantage of, for better or for worse. So it'll be really, really interesting to see how de minimis is impacted from the updated rulings. The only kind of change that's happened is that President Trump has indicated his intent to eliminate de minimis entirely as of July 1st, 2027. And again, it remains to be seen. With that kind of runway, it gives larger merchants and smaller merchants alike time to adjust their supply chain. But, as we kind of parse through the fallout of, what happened last night, we'll have like more and more clarity. So it's really, really interesting to see, how things are going. So yeah, implications to your business. There's four big pieces of global trade, right? There's the de minimis exemption, which may be coming back. There's country of origin, which is like where your product is actually made. The tariff code classification, which dictates how much or how little tariffs you get, and then the declared value of the product. It's been interesting, the conversations that we've had with partners, big and small, about how they're managing these different aspects of their business and how they get things to their customers. Some have stood up facilities in different locations. Some are looking at maybe the first sale rule. Others have done a complete audit of their tariff code, which dictates their HS code. It depends on the vertical. Brian, have you heard anything different from the folks that you've been speaking with?
No, I think, for those who are unfamiliar, right? I mean, the tariff code is ultimately, or the HS code is ultimately how customs determines, ultimately what is in the shipment, right? In addition to the tariff code, details like country of origin are going to impact, those de minimis exemptions. Whether or not punitive tariffs apply to an order or to a shipment. And it's so interesting to see how folks are trying to ultimately react to sourcing the HS codes or their classification strategy, in addition to country of origin. I think a lot of folks, and to try and get out of one of the questions that has come about on every single one of these webinars, Marty. Do you want to hit on or talk a little bit about the difference between the country of manufacture or sometimes the country of origin as it relates to the shipment itself, and how those are not basically one and the same thing as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's something that comes up quite a bit. I'm sure a lot of you understand the difference between the two, but for those who don't, right, country of manufacture is where something's actually made, right? So for example, let's say a t-shirt made in China. And then a lot of times country of origin in terms of the shipping is actually the ship from address, right? So you have a Chinese t-shirt shipping from Canada into the US. That shirt, based on its country of manufacture, is still going to run into Chinese tariffs, right? And a lot of times it's a small business can be misunderstood on country of manufacture versus country of origin, and it can lead to a bad user experience with things getting held up at the border, miscalculating duty rates, especially if you're using your carrier as a broker. You can run into a lot of nasty accessorial fees from carrier for corrections at the border if you're underpaying your duties. So something to be super mindful of.
There's a great question in the chat, Marty, that's kind of that piggybacks on that topic, where they're asking, can you please cover the flat customs fee to China goods to the U.S.? Does it apply to only certain low value imports? Is it for the U.S. Postal Service or commercial carriers like FedEx as well?
Man, that's a good question. So the flat fee from China, I've heard about the EU thinking about implementing a flat fee from China. Don't know off the top of my head the fees that we were considering for in China inbound to the US. I want to say, if I understand what he's asking, or they're asking, is it the flat fees using the Postal Service, I believe. But I honestly don't know the answer to that one off the top of my head, but that's
one we can mark down
with.
for. Yeah, we can mark it down for
afterwards.
follow-up. My understanding is, right, based on the classification of the goods that's provided, there might be some additional punitive tariffs or additional charges that could apply. But the decision has been fairly consistent that it's really on all goods coming from China to the U.S. will have some sort of additional tariff applied to them. We can do some research with our policy folks on the flat customs fee, and whether or not it applies to all imports or just certain low value imports as well.
Yeah, and on this slide, it's actually pretty interesting to see, the amount of tariffs that we've already collected from the IE EPA tariffs. So when we talk about the potential for tariff refunds, if it does go away, it is a substantial amount, right? So if you're looking at just that orange box, right, you're looking at almost $15 billion that wasn't generated in previous years. So when you talk about the scale of the actual the tariffs, it's not nothing. So especially the tariffs that are impacting small medium-sized businesses that have a harder time pivoting quickly, or they're in competitive spaces, that pressure on pricing, and whether they're either building in the tariffs or passing those tariffs on to their customers, it's a really, really interesting thing to see. And yeah, this is just a slide talking about some of the ways that large businesses are reacting to the tariffs. Macy's said that a lot of their goods come from China, and they're gonna have to stop carrying certain things because of the tariffs. John Deere saying that they already hit $100 million in tariffs makes sense given the amount of steel and aluminum tariffs coming from China. But really, kind of just to understand the scale, right? 4 million packages per day being imported under the de minimis exemption are now being forced to get those tariffs. Like, it's quite a bit. The impact from President Trump's tariffs have been sizable. So, again, as things change, I wouldn't be surprised to see those stats change quite a bit, but more to come on those. This slide, I think, is really, really interesting. Brian and I talked about this earlier, but something that, the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol, it's not like they hired like 3,000, 4,000 new people to audit packages coming through the border. But the amount of tariffs and the amount of enforcement results up from January and February through March, We don't have an updated slide yet from Border Patrol with April yet, but we do know the results. Audits have dropped a little bit, but again, another $117 million in duties and fees owed. So, if you were just to average that out over the course of a year, that's almost over $1 billion in extra tariffs from Border Patrol.
There's another interesting question in here, Marty, that is, do you expect trade agreements that were made because of these high reciprocal tariff threats will remain or be contested? I think that's one of those questions where it's pure speculation if you could say, definitively one way or the other. I think there's been constant challenges made to what's being put out there, as most recently as last night with the court stepping in. So it's very difficult to speculate, right, and say whether or not they will remain, whether or not this is a negotiation tactic or strategy. But it's again, it's an exciting time inside of the international compliance space, and it really depends on how you view this, but I like to see this as challenges equal opportunities, and it really gives you an opportunity to kind of take a step back, look at the overarching landscape, and to try and create some strategies to address and ultimately react to what's taking place here, right?
Yeah, it's true, and it's just on smaller shipments alone. I can tell you when you don't react, right, there's downline effects. It's anecdotal, but like a really good friend of mine bought a pair of shoes from Sweden, and they were over a certain value, and he got an email from FedEx asking him to sign a 5601 form, like a border patrol form, and he actually texted me asking if this was fraud because he had never seen the form, ever heard of it before, and he actually ended up not feeling comfortable signing all the paperwork, and he returned the package. So a Shopify Plus brand working in high-end fashion, lost a sale and probably a customer for a while because my buddy was just like, I don't know what this is, I don't feel comfortable, and didn't feel like sending his social security to the Border Patrol, so punted on some shoes. So it does impact people down the line.
It's so interesting too, because in the US, it's just not a behavior or a reality of the supply chain that we're conditioned to, right? I mean, de minimis has been so high for so long that our individual consumer purchases usually would fall below that de minimis threshold before an import duty or tariff was applied to that purchase. But it's not something, you look at countries around the world that the buyers in those countries aren't used to, right? In Canada, they're very familiar with delivery at place, and ultimately, if the carrier is going to require collection of those import duties at the time of delivery at the doorstep, very common in other areas across Europe, inside the United Kingdom. The U.S. de minimis threshold floor is ultimately one of those reasons why we're just not conditioned to that behavior, and it does come as a little bit of a shock to buyers. Being that it's not something that we've seen, in the last, at the very least, the last 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, right. And, the way that the American consumer reacts, I think it is important to focus on the supply chain and like how to be resilient. And this slide speaks to that, right? Like exploring diversification of shipping carriers and or sources of supply. Like, historically, Avalara, a lot of our products have been on the end e-commerce purchase, where it's someone buying a good online and making sure that we have the right HS code, and we're calculating sales tax correctly, to make sure the user has a great user experience, right? And in the last 3 months, what we've seen is a shift where, now we're having conversations with larger partners around how do we build a resilient supply chain? And what they're actually doing is they're using our HS code classification services, they're using our tariff content to make buying decisions, right? Like, I need to buy widgets from either India or, Turkey. Like, what am I actually going to pay when we get those things into our factory in America? And it's been a really interesting shift where it was, maybe 90% e-commerce transactions and kind of that last purchase to now it's shifting more and more to larger businesses making informed decisions on how they're sourcing goods, how they're sourcing materials to build those final products that are getting sent to American consumers. And then, working with customs brokers, ensuring your product details are correct. We've seen a huge spike, obviously, with people making sure product details are correct, because your product details are what, dictate your HS code, which then in turn dictate how many tariffs you pay, or how much tariffs you pay when it comes into across the border, and then building inventory. If we're in this pause, and we've seen companies building up inventory because they don't know what's going to change after this 90-day pause ends. But as much as you can do to try and future-proof yourself, depending on what vertical you're in and what you're selling, those are all smart things to be doing right now.
We talked a little bit about this last night, right? But it's interesting at the time in the calendar year that we're getting to. As we come to the end of summer, we're going to see a lot of folks, ultimately locking down any changes inside their supply chain or inside their digital infrastructure, and go into a code freeze, in preparation for holiday. And there has been so much uncertainty and kind of ping-ponging going on inside the compliance space because of the constant changes in tariffs. That I think one of the consistent, themes in the polls throughout this webinar series has been, folks are just kind of sitting tight and waiting to see what happens when the dust settles, right? But at the end of the day, if you're not prepared or you don't have a strategy to maybe automate, for example, determination of duties and taxes in checkout, it's going to impact your conversion rates, come holiday. If some of these additional tariffs, punitive tariffs applied to purchases, it's so critical to provide buyer transparency and to make sure that you have a partner and a provider that's staying up to date on all of the different legislative changes, and managing the content behind the scenes that is driving those determination needs, that you really could get caught come holiday season and be somewhat unprepared if you don't have somewhat of a strategy in place to kind of automate support for these kind of crazy changing times, whether that's on duties and taxes and checkouts, or ensuring that you can source accurate HS codes inside your supply chain for your brokers and for your customs, and for the customs authorities.
It is true. It's one of those things where, it's summer, feels like it's just starting, but, I think the supply chain professionals watching, not watching, we all know that, peak is coming earlier and earlier than ever, right? Amazon Prime Day, I think, was October 12th last year. And so, we're going to get to July and we're going to start Q3 and people are going to start, peak prep. And, part of that peak prep is going to be sorting through, all of this mess. So, it's really interesting, and something, I'd love to hear. So this poll question we have is, how are you planning to adjust your supply chain due to impending global trade changes, duties, tariff regulation changes, any of the following ways? We've been asking this question from the jump, and it's been really, really interesting to see how answers have changed. So we'd love to hear you guys' answers. If you have made significant changes, we would love to hear in the chat as well. But we'll give some time to let you guys fill this out, and really interested to compare these answers to the way people have been handling things week over week. But yeah, we'll give you guys a minute or so to fill out the form.
Looking at this, we can address one of the other questions that was placed into the Q&A. If tariff costs are itemized on a vendor invoice, what states would require sales tax to be applied? I think on the April 15th webinar, we had Scott Peterson, head of Avalara's government relations, came on and gave an example of responding to this exact question. And on that webinar, he effectively called out that it's ultimately up to the states as to whether or not they would apply sales tax on top of the cost of the item as well as the tariffs. And I believe the response was such that no states today have an exemption on sales tax for the duties and tariffs. And so sales tax would be applied on top of the cost of the item as well as the cost of the import tariffs. And for additional details or for a deeper look on that example, I'd encourage you to go back and watch the live recording of the April 15th webinar as well.
Appropriate. That is the April 15th webinar with a focus on taxes. So I love that. So it looks like we've got a pretty good response rate. So let's run through these. Let's see. Diversifying suppliers, rethinking distribution strategies. I don't know yet. That's fair. I don't know yet is a fair answer. I think, you know, as we sort through what happened last night, it's I think what's really going to happen is people are going to have to make changes quickly, and that can be hard, especially in supply chain, especially when you're embedded in certain spots and you've been embedded for a long time. But I think being proactive and at least being flexible, are definitely going to be important things as we move to start getting into Q3 and we start getting ready for peak shipping season, and having an infrastructure around you that allows you to pivot quickly. The answers over time, it's funny. You would think that I don't know yet has gone down, but it just hasn't. And I think that speaks to the amount of change that we see on a by week to week or bi-weekly basis with the administration and the courts and different geopolitical events happening here and abroad. It's hard to make informed decisions, and I think that's honestly a really nice moment of transparency from businesses that generally consider themselves pretty buttoned up. But I think what you're seeing is the rethinking distribution, diversifying suppliers and manufacturers are all good things to be hopping onto. And then, and this was the other question that was really interesting. What are your plans for addressing the increased costs from global tariffs on your goods? Passing additional costs, including as a tariff surcharge, absorbing the costs, or other? We'll let people respond to it, but anecdotally, I have a story that we were getting new blinds in our house in the last 2 weeks, and we were receiving quotes, and 2 of the 4 quotes included a tariff surcharge in the quote, one at 3% and one at 5%. So, it just speaks to the different way that people are handling things. And if you're curious, we did not get new blinds, so maybe next year. Give a couple more seconds for the answers to the polls.
While we're waiting on results for the polls here, there is another question. Can you provide details on the August 12th deadline for bringing goods in during the 90-day pause window? Is there any new info on this in light of the challenge to the tariff policies?
Not that I'm aware of. I haven't seen anything around the deadline to get things into the U.S.
Yeah, ultimately, I believe the tariffs would apply based on either whether you can prove the date and time as to when the goods left the port of entry prior to hitting, the country of destination, right? So if you have proof as to when your good arrived, and depending on what the tariff rates that were applied at that point in time, you can work with your broker and work with customs to ensure that the right rates are applied. Separately, typically the duty rate that's assessed by customs is going to be based on the date that it arrives, at the border. Especially in a postal scenario, that might be a little bit different when you're shipping with a provider like FedEx or DHL, because a lot of times they are clearing goods in transit. And so, I think you're going to see much more of an impact on the postal side as opposed to the express side, and some of those express services there as well.
Yeah, I think that's good. That's good feedback, especially around in the parcel situation. I think the answers to this, right? 40% passing additional costs on the customer by raising the item price. I think that's the cleanest way to do it. And it's the most common way people have been doing it. If you said other, I would love to hear in the attendee chat, specifically like what y'all are doing. We do work with a lot of different businesses, but if you did respond, other, I would love to hear what y'all are doing just for the education of everyone's sake. And by far and away, the most popular answer has been over time passing on the costs to the end user, right? Not having it broken out, having a part of the actual price of the good. It just makes it the cleanest. In a competitive situation, we've seen people absorb some of the cost of the tariff, eating into their margin, but also, they don't want to impact their conversion rate, especially in their competitive space like fashion or, something with, a high frequency of transactions and where people are price sensitive. Like, unfortunately, we understand that people aren't able to pass on the cost of tariffs, and that's hurting their bottom line. But really, those are like two in a way the most common answers.
And I think it goes to what are the norms of the country where ultimately you're selling and shipping to. Like if you're an e-commerce merchant and you sell online as well as you have stores in country, right? The buyer behaviors in countries across Europe is VAT inclusive pricing, and usually those prices in the stores, are inclusive of the cost to get the goods there as well as the VAT on the sale. And so it's sometimes very important from a buyer and user experience perspective or customer experience to make sure that you're matching prices on your website with that of which you have in store. And so ensuring that you're kind of also understanding what those typical country norms are for price presentation. It should also ultimately be a part of your strategy, as well as to whether you're baking it into the cost of the item or whether you're lining it out as an additional line inside a checkout.
Yeah. And like to that, like supply chain was already hard before all the tariffs, right? Operating on a global scale, being competitive, whether you're brick and mortar or e-commerce or doing both, it's hard. Before all this, over half companies from polls said that cross-border e-commerce was challenging. The challenges you can face are hard, right? Penalties for non-compliance from either Border Patrol or the carrier you're working with, shipments held up in customs, and, poor customer experience and cart conversion and abandonment. These are conversations we have with platforms and merchants alike. And it's hard. It's impacting the bottom line. So, these are all very real challenges, and it's something that we're talking to, companies like, you all here today, every single day. So like, we generally try and keep these pretty non-salesy, and try and be as informative as possible. How can you work with Avalara to, conquer some of these challenges? Really quickly, there's Avatax cross-border. If you're already an Avatax user, Avatax cross-border is a simple way to add on to Avatax to help calculate duties upfront with greater accuracy. So being able to provide like a DDP experience where duties are paid before and your users aren't getting hit with charges when they receive packages. It's something we're seeing more and more, obviously, in e-commerce. And then tariff code classification, making sure that your SKU catalog is appropriately tariffed when things cross-border. That it's all dictated by the HS codes. And then trade restrictions management. Our content team is really, really good, making sure that you're not trying to send things where you're not allowed to ship things, right? Certain people have restrictions on used items. Certain countries have restrictions around foods, cosmetics, things like that. You're always going to get hit with things like that. But real quick, we wanted to show just a 2-minute demo on our HS code classification service, and we will let that play.
Welcome to the Avalara Tariff Content Classification Tool demo. Click to learn how this tool can accurately classify your products. First, choose the country of import. In our example, we will use the US. Click to proceed. Next, select the country of origin. In our example, we will use China. Click to proceed. Next, let's describe our product. Click to proceed. Now, we are ready to classify. Click to proceed. The tariff classification tool needs to know a few more details. Click to select the upper material. Select the lower material. Click to proceed. We've now reached an HS. Click to drill down to reach the HS10. Since our product is a men's golf shoe, click to drill down. Since our product is not welt footwear, click to drill down. We have reached the HS8. Click to find the HS10. We have now reached our HS10. Click to see rate description. Here we can see the total duty amount for this product. This totals 28.5% general rate plus 125% punitive rate, which equals 153.5%. This concludes the demo.
Awesome. So the self-service tariff code classification service that we walked through, we are offering a free trial. So if you are interested in leveraging a tool like that, please let us know. We actually have a poll where you can answer if you are interested in that free trial. I think it's a 5-day free trial for that. Feel free to click yes, and we'll have someone reach out to you. But yeah, I'll give some time for that, and then we can move on to Q&A.
I know we originally had the time set for these webinars at 30 minutes. We've recently extended it to 45. I think we are coming close up to the end of the time that we have here. Really appreciate everyone's engagement, set of questions that have come across. If we didn't get to your question, we will make sure that we have someone from our team follow up and address some of those questions that were there after the webinar, and they'll look to reconnect or get you answers to those questions.
Yeah, that's true. We do have a team of cross-border subject matter experts, guys who have been at UPS and FedEx's international teams, DHL, and everyone who has experience with kind of global cross-border trade. And then this last question here before we hop to QA is, if you do want to talk to one of our subject matter experts around global trade compliance, feel free to hit yes on this, and we'll make sure that someone reaches out to you quickly. But then, yeah, we'll give some time for the poll, and then Brian, I think we can start ripping through some of those questions. So,
Given the 90-day tariff pause, should we continue invoicing customers for tariff charges?
And
I think that's a big strategy question, and something to think about, right? How do you want to support, and what is ultimately your decision there, right? You could be hurting and impacting conversion rate, like we talked about before. If you're an e-commerce merchant, for example, you're assessing some of those additional punitive tariffs that haven't taken effect yet, and still looking to collect for those tariff charges. Ultimately you might lose some conversion. You might lose some buyers in the process. Artie, I don't know if you have a separate thought on that as well.
yeah, I also think knowing what your tariff rate could potentially be impacts that decision making quite a bit, right? Like,
Yep.
if you're bringing in things from China and you end up having to pay the tariff, right? Like having an 145% tariff waiting for you at the end of 90 days would be a tough pill to swallow. So yeah, it's definitely a tough decision to make. If you have the ability to maybe eat some losses on a Chinese good as like a loss leader and make up your money elsewhere, those are things to think about. But you'd want to be really mindful of the amount of exposure you'd want to have risk-wise in terms of those transactions.
Another question here is, do tariffs apply to goods being imported temporarily to the US? Our customers send their parts to the US, we apply a coating, and then we ship them back to the customer. So that goes and bleeds into that country of manufacture topic.
Yeah. So it would depend on a couple things. If it's a B2B transaction and it's not the final sale, right? Potentially no. But if you're using the product, you could be liable for use tax. But if it's for country of manufacturer, if you're shipping into the US, most likely, and I guess it would depend on the entry, but most likely you'd be liable for duties and tariffs. That's something.
And of course, that depends on whether or not you're bringing it into the country in bond or into a free trade zone as well.
Yeah, right. Like that's something you'd want to work with your broker on. Bonded warehouses.
I don't know if you've seen
right
any news differently, but I believe the last that I read on the topic was even for the punitive tariffs, as well as the additional tariffs, they were going to support duty drawback on those items. And so if you did pay duties upon entry into the US and then you ship it back out to another country, there very likely is an opportunity for duty drawback there. And to Marty's point, it's something to absolutely discuss with your broker.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Yeah. I would lean on your broker really hard on that because it might depend on the services they offer as well. I saw a question come in. Does the tariff pause also apply to aluminum and steel derivatives and certificates of melt required? From what I read, the IEEPA tariffs that were received an injunction last night from the CIT court did not include the aluminum and steel derivatives. Everything else could potentially be impacted by that, but the steel and aluminum tariffs would remain. That always could change, just like any of these other tariffs. But from the reading I did last night and before this call this morning, the steel and aluminum tariffs would not be changed.
And of course, as we mentioned at the very beginning of the call, we do not provide tax advice, so we certainly suggest that you socialize those questions as well with your legal teams, your brokers, as well as any compliance staff that you have internal, and always make sure to do your own research as well.
Yeah, definitely. I would definitely lean on the brokers on this. No, Brian, you want to do one more question?
Be patient with your brokers during this time. There's just so much that's unknown, and there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of questions that are out there. Everybody is doing their best to react and to get the responses that can bring clarity to a lot of the questions that are out there. But please remember, this is very new times for everyone, and everyone's doing their best to try to make heads or tails of what this means and how to approach and how to address it from a strategy perspective.
Yeah, just to build on what Brian said, right? There's a lot of supply chain professionals that are, working around the clock on this stuff. In the past, we've had years to understand and sift through policy before we make changes, and now, all of us are forced to, respond at a moment or a tweet's notice. So, be kind to your carriers, be kind to your brokers, because everyone's trying their best, or give them the benefit of the doubt. But with that, I think we'll probably wrap on the Q&A. We have some stuff just to close out on, but thanks everyone for hopping on.
Yeah, thank you both, Marty and Brian, for sharing your expertise with us and going through all of these questions. Just a couple of final reminders before we close out today. So on this slide, you will notice that we have some links to additional resources. There are some blogs, a link to view that tariff code classification demo that we just watched. If you want access to these links, we know you can't click on them right now, but you can download today's slides, and all of those links are available on there. And then also, if you missed this morning, we did record today's session. You will receive a link to the recording in the next few hours. So keep an eye on your email inboxes today if you want to listen to anything again or share it out with other people that you work with. And then also, final reminder, Avalara has a list of upcoming webinars. You can go to avalara.com/webinars and see some of our few webinars. Obviously, we will continue with our trade and tariff going back to Tuesdays in the future. And then we also have one coming up in about 10 minutes, actually, on Are You on the Hook for Communications Taxes? So if you go to avalara.com/webinars, you can sign up for that. And then also might be of interest to the folks on this webinar, we also have HS Codes 101 coming up on June 12th. So if you're interested in any of those, go to our website and you can register for those there. All right. Again, thank you so much to all of our attendees who stuck with us. We know we went a few minutes over, wanted to make sure that we got through as many questions as we did. So thank you again to Marty and Brian for going through all of those. And we hope we will see you for one of our future webinars very soon. Thank you so much, everyone.